join me in welcoming Jarrett Stepman.
Thank you all so much for having me here. It is a real pleasure. I mean, obviously you can tell that I'm a millennial. I'm of the millennial generation. I hope you don't judge us all too harshly. I'm also maybe come from a little bit of a non-traditional background. I'm from Oakland, California, the San Francisco Bay Area. So well, there's some Californians here, but I can't say it's really a bastion of traditional American values, sadly, these days. There was a time maybe long ago, my grandparents' generation perhaps. But what I want to talk about really is, of course, my book's name is The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. I think the idea to write this book really germinated when I was young. See, I think that, and it was great to hear about Howard Zinn. I really do think my generation is seeing the kind of acolytes of Howard Zinn kind of bloom in this country. And I think the real germination for this book for me started at a very young age. Actually, when I was in the second grade, it was. I know the exact date. It was June 6, 1994, when I came. My father came to pick me up at school, and he said, "Well, you know, what did you learn today in your classroom? Did you learn anything important about this special day?" And I said, "Well, no, we didn't really learn much. We learned about writing letters, sending postcards and letters." My dad actually got very angry at this. So he walked into my teacher's classroom and said, these kids, they don't learn much about their history. They don't learn much about where they came from. Why couldn't you just take a brief moment in your class to talk about this day? This is the anniversary of D-Day. I mean, this is the grandfathers of these kids in this classroom. This is a very important day. Don't you think these children should know something about this? And the teacher didn't really understand. She said, well, it wasn't on our agenda. We didn't have time. He says, maybe you could, instead of writing these letters, write them to maybe one of the people that were there that day. Thank them. Teach these kids about what they did, what this moment meant. My parents, after this, decided to pull me out of the school. It was a public school, again, in the Bay Area. And they decided to send me to a private school. And they did educate me about what this country really means, about traditional American values. And it's one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in school choice as a policy. I believe that America is at a crossroads, both politically and culturally. In the post-Cold War world, some conceived an end of history where freedom and prosperity were an inevitability, both at home and abroad, as totalitarian systems crumbled and sank into the dustbin of history. But that post-Cold War glow has long ago cracked. First by 9/11, and then by a financial collapse that eroded for many the concept of the American dream and the idea that the next generation will be more prosperous than the last. Now the U.S., once the unquestioned superpower, atop a benign system of globalized capitalism, seems fragile, perhaps even threatened by a rising China which quietly integrated itself into that system, yet failed to adopt the ethos of liberty and rights that we took for granted as based on self-evident truths. Into that maelstrom has arisen perhaps the greatest challenge of all. A once confident American people are racked by doubt and division. Was America ever really great? Are our achievements ephemeral? Are triumphs built on little more than exploitation? Our forefathers figuratively and literally unworthy of praise or any kind of remembrance other than contempt? Was it really the American system that belonged in the ash heap of history? In a world of rising socialism and populism, immigration and cultural dislocation, it is essential that America and Americans recommit themselves to the timeless ideas that have truly undergirded our success, recommit ourselves to the informed patriotism that President Ronald Reagan called for in his farewell address, so that we can foster and further that which is best about our country. This while coming to an understanding of our faults and failures, so that we neither repeat the mistakes of the past, nor do we deceive ourselves into believing that a utopian future awaits us. If we only tell ourselves that we must assuredly be on the right side of history, as long as we yell loudest for social justice. And the image I really come up for in my mind is a recent tweet by a gun control activist, David Hogg. You may have heard of him. He's now going to Harvard University. He actually tweeted this. This is not from the Babylon Bee or the Onion or anything like this. He said, "This is a tweet for the founders of the gun violence prevention movement, started centuries ago by almost entirely black, brown, and indigenous LGBTQ women and non-binary people that never got on the news or in most history books. We may not know all your names, but thank you." Well, you won't know their names because they aren't real. This carefully calibrated but ahistoric word salad of a statement nonetheless sums up the ethos of large swaths of social justice warriors who intend to demolish our history and replace it with something detached from reality, but in accordance with their views. History, real history, is complicated and rarely fits into the neat boxes of rigid ideology. This doesn't mean there aren't heroes and villains, that there aren't right ideas and immoral ones, as there certainly are. But it means that we shouldn't need to ensure that we come to celebrate and emulate those who neatly fit into our intellectual milieu or look and act just as we do. The bottom line, though, is, especially considering the deep past, is that authors of the very best and most celebrated aspects of what we are today came from deeply flawed people, many of whom have been or very soon will be canceled by our so-called modern cancel culture. At the same time, though, we may wrap ourselves in the warm blanket of political correctness in our own day. We may, and almost assuredly will, run afoul the standards of both the future and the past. Who would have more right to judge us? The people 200 years in our future or 200 years in our past? While many Americans today are proud of our expanding definition of marriage, for instance, the institution as a whole has been eroded. Broken homes and communities now suffer from the consequences of this change in American life that previous generations would have looked on with horror, and I hope future ones will correct. And as for our criticism of slavery, I do wonder how future generations will look at the issue of abortion, where the right to not just liberty but life itself has been violated on a mass scale. Unfortunately, today, Americans have increasingly little understanding of their own history. According to a survey released in 2018, Americans are woefully uneducated about the most basic facts of our past. The study by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation found that only 1 in 3 Americans can actually pass the U.S. citizenship test, which asks the most basic questions about our history and how our system of government works. It's a worrying trend in a republic based on self-government and consent. Education, civic education in particular, must be a new priority for the American people. Many of our schools have failed in this, which is why I'm such a strong proponent of school choice and homeschooling, so that parents can put pressure on schools to do a better job of teaching young people and ensuring that we continue to have an educated citizenry. Worse than the simple decline in knowledge, which is really the crux of what we are discussing here today, there have been pernicious attempts to step into this void, to reframe our history around the belief that tyranny and injustice, not liberty, is our national inheritance. The works of Howard Zinn, especially his book, A People's History of the United States, which presents a deeply flawed and distorted account of American history, has made remarkable inroads into our K-12 education and has an outsized influence on young American minds for a generations. Sadly, it appears the so-called American elite has bought in. According to another poll conducted in 2018, only 39% of college graduates say they are extremely proud to be an American. What does that say of our future leaders who are necessary to guide our country in the 21st century? No wonder Americans are in such a populist mood. For the next generation, those numbers may be even worse if we stay in the current course. Undoubtedly, many of you have heard of the New York Times 1619 Project, which aims to, quote, reframe this country's history and place the year 1619, in which African slaves were first brought to the Virginia colony, as our true founding, rather than 1776. Well, the study and understanding of American slavery, an abomination of an institution that was brought to a bloody close in 1865, is an important one. The 1619 Project, again, creates a mangled and often outright falsified account of our history. In fact, it is so flawed that eminent historians James McPherson, who works on Civil War, are must-reads, and Gordon Wood, who is one of America's greatest founding-era historians, lambasted it in interviews at the World Socialist website, published by Trotskyite International Committee of the Fourth International, no less. It would be a mistake to think, however, that the aims of the 1619 Project are not socialist and deeply anti-capitalistic. Many of the authors of the various essays are part of the so-called New History of Capitalism School of Research and tie the development of capitalism in America entirely to slavery. The critique of a handful of Trotskyites represents merely a criticism of strategy, not of the project's ultimate goals. They merely fear that traditional Marxist ideas of class conflict will be replaced by racial conflict and make the project impossible in a multiracial society, and that very well may be true. But these Trotskyites represent an older generation, out of step with younger socialists like me, most notably ones like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who easily and seamlessly blend ideas about race, class, and gender with their socialist ideas. As I learned when I attended a socialist conference last year in Chicago, the concept of intersectionality has superseded traditional notions of class conflict for the general socialist movement in America. And that is why the war on history is so essential to their ultimate aims. They must convince Americans of all stripes that this country has always been deeply unjust. They cultivate grievance and discontent in order to lead Americans to think that our whole system, from the Constitution up, socially and politically, must be utterly reordered. So it's deeply worrying that the 1619 Project, filled with historical inaccuracies and imbued with a radical agenda, is partnering with the Pulitzer Center to create curriculum for American high school students. Chicago, Washington, D.C., Buffalo, New York, and a growing number of school districts have already picked up and introduced the 1619 Project curriculum into their classrooms, often through administrative fiat. In fact, there was an important article recently published by Real Clear Investigations titled, "Disputed New York Times 1619 Project Already Shaping School Kids' Minds on Race." I'd encourage you to read it. It explains how the 1619 Project is not just aimed at readers of the New York Times, perhaps a dwindling number of people, but toward a larger goal of transforming the next generation. The Real Clear piece said that more than 3,500 classrooms in all 50 states have already adopted the curriculum, and has a very real and direct set of policy goals. For instance, one of the goals of the project's creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones, is to get reparations passed. Again, this only goes to show that not only should the doctrines of these projects be rebutted in the public square, but options for parents to both put pressure on school districts to change and open up a path to remove their children from that environment are essential. In my book, The War on History, I both re-examine America's past and explain and ultimately defend the ideas and people that have been essential both to our goodness and greatness as a country. I explain, I hope, that while America may have never been perfect, it has always been committed to a great cause, that people of all backgrounds can appreciate what it is and continue to be. Was Christopher Columbus really a villain, a greedy butcher and slaver who stood out as particularly brutal and barbaric in his day? Or was he instead a fundamentally decent man who should be honored both for his bravery and his world-transforming voyages that have reaped not just violence and misery as his detractors suggest, but some of the most positive and important aspects of the world we now live in? From his small ships, great civilizations were built, including ultimately the United States. Millions of Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, one of the most quintessential holidays. Did the Pilgrims and Puritan colonists do little more than bring violence, bloodshed, and oppression to the shores of the New World? Is Thanksgiving itself problematic, to be replaced by a national day of mourning, or perhaps unthanksgiving, as some have taken to calling it? Or do the Puritans leave us an important legacy of self-government, of a dream to create a virtuous and pious society, a country that will be as a shining city upon a hill, as John Winthrop once said, later to be quoted by Reagan and many others? Did they not, through their desire to escape persecution and create a society based on their specific religious beliefs, create a long-term path for religious liberty that is a cornerstone of American exceptionalism? Is the legacy of Thomas Jefferson one of slavery and hypocrisy, or is instead an essential and very American one of declaring that in a time when slavery and serfdom were ubiquitous, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, stamping the culture of liberty onto our birth certificate and placing the first of many nails in the coffin of slavery forever? Could there be a new birth of freedom following the Civil War without the teeming millions of Americans committed to the unionism of Andrew Jackson and ultimately the anti-slavery message of Abraham Lincoln, who built on Jefferson and the founders' legacy? As flawed as even that new birth was, would there even be an America following that terrible Civil War without old foes like Robert E. Lee, who insisted after the war that we must raise the next generations as Americans and nothing else? Could America have emerged a strong and unified country in the wake of the massive immigration to our shores in the 19th and early 20th centuries without the ideas of patriotic assimilation put forth by men like Theodore Roosevelt? Or are the words patriotism and assimilation problematic and hateful? Could America, still struggling with the legacy of segregation and other injustices, nevertheless triumph over the twin evils of the 20th century, fascism and communism, without the legacy of all these men and the consequences of these eras, without the immense power of our capitalistic system, which provided unmatched prosperity in peacetime and unmatched strength in war? Victory by either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union would have ushered in a new and almost unimaginable dark age that would have spanned the globe. Instead, America, flawed as it was and always will be, rose triumphant, and however imperfectly, aspired to be a beacon of liberty for all those who wish to be free. The war on American history is a lost cause and provides nothing but dead ends. It leaves this nation, I truly believe, the greatest and freest in human history, hopelessly splintered, at war with itself, unable to accept the past as it was and our neighbors as they are. Today, as new and potent threats to liberty emerge in our world, it is essential that Americans come to understand and deepen their appreciation of our history, reject the noxious identity politics that threaten to shatter the concept of e pluribus unum, and embrace an inclusive Americanism that can unite this country in the face of its challenges. These are the stakes in the war on history, a war we have to win for the sake of our past and our future. Thank you very much.